It was all. I use my cell phone.
Oh, yes. More nice.
Those you went to Cedar Bend, I heard it was a good weekend. Good weather, no concussions during the canoeing. Anyone have Cedar Bend coming up this weekend? The cold that's coming through here won't happen up there. It's gonna stay warm up there for you. So it's not gonna be in the 40s when you're sleeping down. No. Gonna be good weather up there. So looking at the discussion boards, look like 9 people did not complete last week's, 9 have not completed this week so far. It's okay, there's no penalty for late work. Just be aware that you'll want to, especially last week's chapter, you might want to have that stuff on hand when it comes time to write your midterms, which is going to be a week from Thursday. So today is our last relevant lecture for the midterm. Thursday, we will take our time working through the guidelines and also provide an opportunity for you to suggest possible essay subjects. I don't give you the essay subjects if you've looked at the guidelines on the announcements page. I don't give you the subjects or the arguments, the questions. You come up with that yourself. And then you write essays based on your observations. I will allow you to submit them, submit statements to me in advance, and I help you formulate them and give you approval, give you some approval, things like that. But you're coming up with the stuff yourself. So After today's lecture, it's time for you to start shifting into historian mode. You're going to be the storyteller coming up. So if you don't know what these exams are going to look like, I would suggest you get on the announcements page today and look at what you're going to have to do. But we will review for it on Thursday. All right. So then let's get into the last lecture. We are, of course, talking about the origins of slavery and white supremacy in North America. Europe, at the time of colonization of the New World, did not have slavery. It's something that they had to reinvent when they came. The Spanish immediately began enslaving Native American populations when they came in Central and South America. It was a little bit more of a gradual process in North America. The French didn't do it at all. And the English are kind of gradually working their way towards it. The Puritans first enslaving Native Americans, the enslavement of Africans through the slave trade. You know, that is happening rapidly in English colonies in the Caribbean, where England is producing the world's sugar. In North America, though, the tobacco plantations, it's not predominantly African slaves. In the 1600s, it's mainly English indentured servants. And that's kind of, where we were leaving off, and suggesting as well that not only was the Chesapeake labor market, more fluid, just because you began your life as an indentured servant, effectively a slave, didn't mean you're going to end your life that way. And as well, too, just because you came through the African slave trade and were sold in North America, did not mean you were going to necessarily end your life a slave. We talked about Anthony Johnson, kind of the free African community, right? Anthony Johnson was an African who ended up owning slaves himself. Suggesting that this kind of gone with the wind picture we have of slavery does not fit the early years of on free labor in North America. And so the question for us then is, well, what changed, right? If it's not slavery, permanent hereditary lifetime enslavement of persons of African descent, then early on, if it's just this more kind of fluid, frankly, multiracial system, then what changed? What led to that gone with the wind, very black and white situation of the 19th century? And we have to look at factors after 1650, external to the colonies, internal as well, too. External, it has to do with changes in the international labor market. It would be crucial towards driving a shift away from indentured servitude of English peoples towards African slavery. Two simple things are going to happen after 1650, especially the next 50 years around 1700. The English were looking, in the first half of the 1600s, were looking to leave England by the tens of thousands. England not only was a place of scarcity, but England was a place of great political unrest. England's not even a monarchy for 13 years. They cut off the king's head in 1647. Monarchy is not restored till 1660, but even then, just politically, the place is a mess. And many people are like, maybe it's best to get out of here. So the English were looking to leave in large numbers. That will not be the case in the 18th century, especially after 1689, the Glorious Revolution. England's political fortunes really begin to settle down at that point. And increasingly, with English stop leaving England. They're not coming to the New World, right? Who had been the primary kind of on-free laborers in Virginia area, the Chesapeake, throughout the 1600s, it had predominantly been English workers, the English lower classes. They're not going to come anymore. So that's stopping. Who's going to do the labor now that the English are not coming in? You will see an uptick in other Europeans coming into the New World, but that's not enough to satisfy the labor needs of the colonies. So where's that labor going to come from? England will begin its own slave trade in Africa in the 1640s. And by 1700, England is bringing roughly 5,000 enslaved Africans a year through the Middle Passage into the New World. Most of those Africans are going into the Caribbean, where they're going to work in sugar plantations, but more and more are going to come into North America, especially as the supply of English laborers dries up. So all this is to say is that factors external to what's going on in colonies would help shift the colonies away from English labor, English indentured servitude, shift towards a permanent African slavery. Right? It's things going on in the international labor market that are going to drive this shift. But it's also things internal to the colonies as well, too, that are going to encourage it. And that brings us back to where we left off last time, Bacon's Rebellion. Now, you're all experts in the facts of Bacon's Rebellion now, because you watched the wonderful Hot Dog History. The actual facts, I mean, you could get that from McClay. The actual facts, details, who did what to who, are not as important as the understanding the causes and kind of lessons learned from Bacon's Rebellion. Right? Bacon's Rebellion occurred because of the ambiguities that I talked about in last lecture. The ambiguities of the Chesapeake Society was a place where you could begin your life as a slave, earn your freedom, and then want to become a master yourself. We talked about when more and more people start living out the terms of their contract, they want to become tobacco farmers, they want laborers, all the problems that's going to cause in the Chesapeake. Increasing rush for land brings on increasing conflict with Native Americans and increasing unrest between the established planter classes and kind of the upstart ones, or the indentured servants, who are kind of looking at what's going on and saying, why am I working so hard? Like, what are my prospects going to be once I earn my freedom? There's a lot of frustration going in the 1640s, in the 1650s, into the 1660s. Nathaniel Bacon, for reasons unrelated to these circumstances, taps into that grievance. You know, he knows that workers are upset. He knows that kind of new planter class are upset, and he says, "Hey, follow me. I got the answers." You know, and he leads this army of indentured servants, some English, but some African as well too, leads this revolt, which leads to a massacre of Native Americans, but also the burning of Jamestown in 1676, Bacon's Rebellion. Right, so the actual, what happens during that is not as important as to understand is why did it happen. Right? Bacon's Rebellion happened not because of Nathaniel Bacon, it happened because people were upset at what was happening. This increasing pressure on the plantation system, increasing frustration of workers or new planters who feeling like they're either getting squeezed or their opportunities in the future are going to be limited. They're getting angry, and Bacon just comes along at the unfortunate moment to tap into all that, leading to this mass destruction in 1676. What is the lesson learned after Bacon's Rebellion? Maybe, if this fluid labor system, a system in which slaves could earn their freedom and become masters themselves, desiring land, desiring labor, if that led to Bacon's Rebellion, maybe the lesson would be, maybe we shouldn't free our workers. Maybe we should have a permanent class of workers who can't rise up in the way that all these people did to follow Nathaniel Bacon. And so, understand what is going to drive this shift towards permanently on-free African labor in the colonies in the 18th century. It's what's transpiring between 1650 and 1700. Internationally, it's what I just said. It's the English stopped coming, Europeans have stopped coming to the New World, whereas England is bringing in more slaves or bringing in more Africans. Of course, driving down the price then of African labor, right? The more there is of a, to use it means to use the crude economic terms, the more product there is in a market, the price lowers, right? With an increased supply of African laborers, that's going to drive down the cost and make that more desirable than trying to purchase the increasingly scarce indentured servants, right? So it's international changes that are taking place, but it's also these internal recognitions that our system is broken. A system in which we are bringing in all these workers who have the expectation of upward mobility. It's not working, and we have to figure out how to fix it. Now, it would be nice to be able to point to a particular, journal entry or blog post or something like that, where somebody's saying the lessons we learned from Bacon's Rebellion, we don't have that, right? People are not writing down their thoughts and feelings quite like that. And so how we kind of connect the dots through this is a little more complicated. There's a wonderful book by Edmund Morgan, American Slavery, American Freedom. Most of us who teach on Bacon's Rebellion, we borrow from that book. So feel free, if you want to fact check me ever, to go check out Edmund Morgan's American Slavery, American Freedom. He's the one who suggested the centrality of Bacon's Rebellion in changing people's minds. What led Morgan and what leads us to say that's a convincing thesis is looking at the legislation that's rising in the Chesapeake regarding slavery. In Massachusetts, they moved pretty quickly towards defining slavery, right? They established Massachusetts in 1629. By 1641, they've already created a system in which they could permanently hold Native Americans enslaved. The Chesapeake is a lot slower. They're established in 1607. They're still, even at the time of Bacon's Rebellion, they still have not defined kind of lifetime servitude yet. They're moving towards it, right? There's court cases declaring an Anthony Johnson a slave owner. There's laws that are popping up. For instance, in 1660, a major leap forward in defining slavery in the Chesapeake. The legislature that year said, what if you have parents who are considered to be enslaved and they have kids? What's the status of the kid? Look, all these things that we take for granted, oh, the kids of slaves obviously are enslaved themselves. There's nothing logical or rational about that. People have to make decisions to declare that to be the case. You're saying that just because a person happens to be born to this particular person, that person is going to be a slave for life? I mean, that's a huge logical leap. It's one we accept as well. Of course, it is, but somebody had to say, at some point in history, had to say, yeah, this is how we're going to treat those kids. Because there were other societies, Africa, for instance, where that was not necessarily assumed. Just because you were born a slave, you were going to be considered a slave yourself. In 1660, Virginia said, let's settle this issue. The status of the mother determines the status of the kid. If the mother is considered to be a slave, permanently on free, then her kid is going to be considered permanently on free. And so you have in 1660, before Bacon's Rebellion, you have the establishment of hereditary slavery, right? I mean, the first thing you have to do is define, define you can hold a person for their life. But it's even a greater leap to say if that person has any kids, we can hold them as slaves as well too. Virginia gets there by 1660. They're saying the kid status is determined by the mother. But these kind of laws are few and far between, right? I wish that we had like a lot more like diaries and reports and things like that. We just don't. So much of that stuff was not saved. It was destroyed by fire, by flood. Just not that much comes to us from the colonial period. The one thing that does tend to remain are legislation that was passed by the Chesapeake legislature. And so we historians we're trying to kind of tease out how did this conception of slavery develop. The main thing we have to rely upon are the laws themselves. And what we see when we look at the legal code is Virginians are moving gradually towards defining permanently on free, hereditarily on free. They're moving slowly towards it. And then Bacon's Rebellion comes. And then things seem to speed up. We get a lot more laws regulating not just the status of enslaved persons, but the status of even free Africans. It becomes impossible for an Anthony Johnson after Bacon's Rebellion to exist. I think even by the time of Bacon's Rebellion, Johnson and his family had left because they felt like they were going to get pinched, and they did. The property was taken over, but they had run away before then because they felt like they could see that they were not going to be able to remain here anymore. Virginia is becoming a different place in the second half of the 17th century. And you see that reflected in laws. You see it, for instance, what happens if a person converts to Christianity, right? One of the main markers for how a person could be considered permanently unfree is that they weren't a Christian. So slaves here or Africans hear this and they say, let's convert to Christianity, then we'll be free. Legislature after Bacon's Rebellion says, no, sorry, even if you convert to Christianity, you're still a slave. You're a slave before, you're going to be a slave after. We're going to take that religion escape clause out. Gun ownership. What you see in Virginia after Bacon's Rebellion is you see a push to expand gun rights and gun usage among the English inhabitants. So you get mustering. Mustering is the guys, all different classes come together to kind of do militia work, right? It just makes sense, right? You don't want a future uprising. Who's going to do that police work? Well, it has to be militia that does that police work. And so you see the increased rising of militiaing, particularly by white English descended men. Part of the reason that this was going on was to kind of help reconcile the classes. It was, all white men, both indentured servants all the way up to the planter classes come together for these drills and exercises. This is a way to kind of build a male fraternity of an English male fraternity around gun ownership. Probably some beer there too. Nothing to bring white guys together like guns and beer, right? Maybe a little Toby Keith thrown in too. Conversely, we see laws restricting the gun ownership of your Anthony Johnsons, even your free African descendants. Their gun rights are taken away during these years. So you see an attempt to kind of separate workers from planters, but also English from African during these years. So it's speeding up. We look at the laws, and I could send you the website with all the different laws. Historians have kind of pieced these things together to show. You see this, more laws, more efforts to try to define and settle these kinds of issues after 1676, culminating in 1705. Oh, that's sorry, it was 1661. That's the law saying that a child's status is determined by the mother. Virginia slave code to 1705. Now, the English had developed slave codes before this. They needed, wherever there were large populations of enslaved persons, permanently on free enslaved persons, slave codes came along to kind of justify that practice. So our first slave codes come out of the Caribbean. South Carolina, I think, is the first English colony in North America to develop a slave code. Virginia's comes in 1705. You've seen, a law here, a law there, a couple laws this year, a couple laws that year, and then boom, 1705, 21 laws. 21 laws are passed. The Virginia slave code's really trying to finally in the southern colonies establish what is slavery and who can be a slave, right? All the 21 laws essentially relate to those two questions: who can be a slave and what is slavery. That first passage is kind of the main text. All servants imported and brought into this country by sea or land who were not Christians in their native country shall be accounted and be slaves, and such be here brought and not sold, notwithstanding a conversion to Christianity afterwards. In another place in the laws, slaves are considered to be real estate. What is a slave? It's real estate. A slave is property, but a particular kind of property. They're real estate. Again, Virginia's trying to nail down the ambiguities of one person being able to hold another person as somehow like in servitude. Yeah, there's been slavery throughout history, but it's always a tough kind of thing to try to rationalize and pull off, right? Especially when slave systems have died out and the English are in a situation now where they're deciding to kind of restart it. Intellectually justifying an institution like slavery, permanently on free, hereditarily on free labor, is really hard to do, because human beings were kind of human beings kind of, we all kind of look and act the same because we kind of have a common creator. You guys been to Sunday school, you're Adam and Eve and God and Jesus and all that stuff. Yeah. So it's really hard to pull that off, but people have done that through the ages, and that's what the English are doing now. The Puritans, interestingly, those God-fearing Puritans got pretty quickly to finding Native Americans as permanently on free. Virginia has taken a little bit longer, but they're going to get there in 1705. Slaves are going to be real estate. And real estate has a special meaning in English culture, right? The culture, the legal system that you and I were born and raised in. So look, in 2010, I bought a piece of about a half acre of land over in Jackson with a house on it, right? How do we know that's my land? Well, I can show you a piece of paper that says that that's my land. I die. Does that land stop being mine? We go to my wife. She dies. Is it still my land? Yeah, it goes to my son. He dies. What did he have kids? There are other relatives. Maybe he left it to. Maybe my son Matthew decides to leave it to his Call of Duty buddy. Now they drop another piece of paper that says, hey, when Matthew dies, Call of Duty buddy gets my property. It goes to him, right? But where did it all begin? Me. In English law, it's possible for me to eternally hold that piece of land, even after death. Think of the implications of that. Think of the implications of that for defining a person that is real estate. I die. Is that slave free? No, they become the property of whoever left it. What if that person, what if that real estate has like kids too? Kind of like having a orange tree on your property. Trying to think of a little bit more relevant for Michigan. Cherry tree. There you go. We have cherry, right? Yeah, cherry, like a cherry tree on my property, right? The cherries grow on there. Those are my cherries, right? I mean, I can do with them what I want. I can eat them or I can like throw them in, right? Yeah, and that's kind of how the kids are treated too. Well, slaves are real estate. People are real estate. And so if they have kids, well, that kid's mine too. Or it's my descendants, right? So, in 1705, I don't know, the eternal relationship is defined between slave owners and the enslaved. You legally worked out in a way that this relationship of subordinate to superior doesn't ever have to be dissolved. Now, with that, I say a lot of those laws define the rights of English Christian servants, and in the process of doing so, also define rights that slaves don't have. Slaves, rights that they had before. I mean, Anthony Johnson could go and sue in court before under the new Virginia slave codes. That can't be done. Even a right to life. A right to life is protected by English servants under these laws. Guess who doesn't have a right to life? In fact, the laws are really explicit. If a master, I'm paraphrasing, if a master correcting his slave shall kill him, to be absolved of any crime. It becomes legal in 1705 to murder under the Virginia slave codes, because you're not actually murdering a person. You're just, if I want to go out and pour salt and vinegar all over my property so that nothing can grow there, I have a right to do that, right? So if I kill my slaves, it might be dumb, might be economically unwise move, but it is not illegal and it's not immoral because you didn't kill a person. Slave. So slavery is finally defined as real estate in Virginia in 1705. Again, to my point, when are the first Africans brought on the slave trade? 1619. When is Virginia finally getting around to developing its own slave code? 1705. So again, understand that slavery has a very gradual development here. There are many points. Historians like to look for those paths not taken, right? It's important to understand the paths we did take. It's also important to understand the paths we did not take, right? Virginia and the Chesapeake was developing in a very different way than we remember. In a more fluid, multiracial kind of period, it was developing a system of on-free labor, probably more typical of Africa at the time. But for reasons external to the colonies, internal to the colonies, they eventually settle on a system of permanently on-free, hereditarily on-free labor, which will grow to be arguably the worst form of slavery to ever exist on this planet. We've had, I would say we probably have had at least 3, possibly 4 iterations of slavery in North America. The slavery that you're most familiar with, the Django Unchained, the Gone with the Wind slavery, is probably slavery 3.0 or 4.0, and it's one of the worst slaveries that this world has ever seen. But it's beginning here in 1705. Virginians recognizing that the English are increasingly not coming, increasingly there is a supply of Africans being brought on English ships. They're preparing for a flood of African laborers and not even going down the Anthony Johnson road of giving them a chance for freedom. They're going to be permanently on free. So I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. One thing I said these slave codes are answering is, what is a slave? Well, the real estate. Who is a slave? All servants imported and brought into this country of sea land who were not Christians in their native country. These are the old markers of racial discrimination that I talked about in the last lecture. Persons who are foreign, persons who are not Christian. Who could be a slave or find himself permanently on free, hereditarily on free in Virginia after 1705. A person who is not a Christian, and a foreign born person, imported into this country. It's a pretty narrow sphere of who could fit this category. Now, if we read through the laws, you would see they still talk about Native Americans, right? They're still thinking of enslaving Native Americans. they talk about mulatto, children of mixed races. That was always a tricky one for the law, right? So say an African and an Englishman have a child together. What is the status of that child? Or an enslaved woman and her English master have a child together. What is the status of that child? The 1705 laws more or less say all mixed race children are slaves. That's how they clean up that ambiguity. Mixed race children, they're going to be treated as slaves. But of course, what's being described here, especially that imported and brought into this country, very much is pointing towards the increasing influx of African laborers on the slave trade being brought into North America. So it's still, I mean, the slave codes still kind of reflect back on a history of enslaving Native Americans, enslaving mixed race children, but it's also looking to a future of increasingly enslaving Africans brought into this country. And of course, the numbers bear that out. And we talked about these numbers. Between 1619 and 1700, an estimated 28,000 Africans were brought into the colonies as laborers. We know their status was a lot more ambiguous than future versions of African laborers. The Anthony Johnson story stands out there. After 1700, it seems like that ambiguity doesn't exist anymore. There's no or very little wiggle room anymore for Africans to find themselves free. Increasingly, as African populations increase in North America, they are considered permanently and hereditarily unfree. The number of enslaved Africans brought into North America between 1700 and 1776, the time of our American Revolution, was about 250,000. Massive increase in African laborers with natural increase in population, an estimated 350,000 enslaved Africans at the time of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Like if masters wanted to free their slaves?
No,
I'm sorry, I'm not sure what the. Oh, what white masters want to impregnate their female slaves, have the kid, and the kid can be a slave as well. Nope. It was one that was, I mean, sexual abuse was a part of the system. Not as extensive in the 18th century as in the 19th century. In the 19th century, it's almost systematic. The 18th century, it was common. The only real roadblock, legally there was no roadblock to that. The only roadblock would be the master's conscience. And we do have, you know, of course, the great example of the master's conscience getting in the way of that practice is Thomas Jefferson, who fathered children with Sally Hemings. Those children were then Jefferson's slaves, but he was obviously conflicted over it. When Jefferson died, he freed the children that he had with Sally Hemings. So that would be the only issue. Legally, there is no roadblock to a master being able to impregnate their slaves because they would increase their slave population. Somebody else over there. We're good. No other questions? At this time? Well, it's mainly English ships now bringing slaves into the English colonies. Portugal started it, but then the Dutch become involved. I think through a lot of the early half of the 1600s, it's Dutch ships that are bringing slaves into North America. And then the second half of the 1600s and into the 1700s, it's mainly English ships bringing in slaves into the English colonies. England's trying to keep everything kind of in-house at that point, and they can do so because they have developed their own slave trade. But I mean, almost every European maritime state had a slave trade going. But I think for North America, the Dutch and the English were the biggest suppliers of slaves into North America. So you have a very gradual definition of slavery as permanently on free, hereditarily on free in the 1600s, and a gradual movement towards hinging that exclusively on persons of African descent. In the 1700s, you see a rapid increase in that. I think that this messes with, I don't know if we even have an answer to this because it's not a question that we probably asked that much. At least I certainly don't remember talking about this with Coach, which is, you know, how did slavery develop, or what's the relationship between slavery and white supremacy? And I think in absence of thinking about that, if you just had to answer on the spot, I think most people would say, well, white people thought they were superior to people of color, and so they enslaved them. History seems to suggest the opposite is true. History seems to suggest that slavery developed, and white supremacy came along later. You even see that in the Virginia slave codes, right? They're defined into slave codes in anticipation of increasing numbers of Africans being brought into North America. You see, I mean, the slave codes are defining what a slave is, who can be a slave, but what's the rationale for holding a person as a slave? It's still the old racial markers. You know, I've tried to make this point. Racism is as old as human history, but the content of racism has changed, right? People make decisions that lead to a kind of racial discrimination or racial exploitation. We're so used to thinking of race solely in terms of physiology and specifically skin color, but historically speaking, race and racism has been characterized by different features. In early North America, racism was not really about physiology, not about skin color. It seemed to be about what religion were you and where were you born. Otherwise, an Anthony Johnson never could have happened, right? As I put up there kind of early on, right? Christianity was a racial identity, a regional identity, and a religious identity. We've been talking around that at the, we were talking about like Jesuit missionaries, English missionaries, and I thought about Native Americans, getting more explicit with it here, right? Christianity was a way to distinguish us versus them, who should not be exploited for their labor, who should be exploited for their labor, non-Christians. So the point is, racism is there early on, but it's just not race the way we understand it. It was race that was tied up with a person's religious identity and where they were from, right? Africans could be discriminated against, Africans could be targeted for lifetime hereditary slavery because they weren't Christian, because they weren't English. And you still see that in the laws. When you read through the laws, you'll see English and Christian as a way of distinguishing who has rights, what laborers have rights in Virginia, which laborers do not. And it still had to do with a person's religious status. And it still had to do with place of birth. But these laws are also transitional too, right? If we're right that slavery comes first, white supremacy develops later on to justify that enslaved practice. You begin to see that in the laws. You can see that kind of second paragraph there. You'll see some of those distinctions. Certain things that couldn't be done. So for instance, previously, an Anthony Johnson could purchase a Christian servant. He's not going to be able to do so anymore. But notice that phrase, except of their own complexion. When you're trying to determine, like, when is a society rightly considered white supremacist, you want to look at their laws. You want to see that whiteness literally encoded in the country's laws. You begin to see that in 1705 in Virginia. You begin to see the legislature specifying not just English servant, but you keep reading there, not just Christian servant, but white Christian. Oh yeah, Christian white servant thrown in there. Sometimes it's white Christian servant, sometimes it's Christian white servant, and I've counted it up. I've read through the laws. I think white only appears maybe 5 or 6 times. It's really just kind of hiding in there. So it's not something even at the time you'd necessarily pay all that much attention to, but in retrospect, knowing that a legal system of white supremacy does develop after this time, you do kind of see a kind of white privilege embedded in these laws, right? It's not just Christian servants, it's not just English servants, but it's white Christian English servants. So you start to see physiology, and particularly complexion or skin color, begin to take on this life of its own, determining your status as a protected laborer with a right eventually to freedom versus an unprotected laborer with no right to freedom in the future, and have that somehow hinge upon your complexion, your physiology. If you've never taken the time to just stop and think about how stupid white supremacy is, please do that. All right. I know that things are ubiquitous and normal. We often go unquestioned, but just think about how stupid it really is. Particularly for people who, hypothetically, like Spring Arbor, accept a Christian theology, how absolutely ridiculous white supremacy is. But what we know is that British North America, eventually becoming the United States, was a white, did not begin as a white supremacist state, absolutely became one. Absolutely became one, where whiteness was coded into our laws as bearing with you certain privileges. For the first half of our history, that whiteness bearing with it who could be a slave and who could not. Now, it would be nice to be able to say, like when did this happen? Like, when did kind of modern racism develop in North America? When did they stop talking about the Christian status or non-Christian status of Africans? When did they stop talking about, whether an African was imported into the country, whether they're born here in an English colony? When did they stop talking about that? When did they start focusing more on skin color? It'd be nice to be able to say, well, it was 1738, but we can't. We have to generalize. And looking at the evidence, what we can say is slavery is developing, very gradually over the course of the 1600s. White supremacy, not so much. Still, in 1705, when slavery is defined, white supremacy is still very ill-defined in these laws. It's there, but it's really not that prominent. And so the best that I could say is that white supremacy developed as a justification for slavery, as a primary justification for slavery during the 18th century, when the population of Africans in the British colonies went from 28,000 to 350,000. It was during those 80 years that white supremacy developed as a way to justify this increasing practice of slavery. Such that when we come to the United States, the founding of the United States in 1788, white supremacy is built into our laws. This is the first Naturalization Act, right? This is not a part of the Constitution, but after the Constitution was ratified, is one of the first pieces of legislation that Congress devised, right? And now it's a Naturalization Act. How can a foreigner become an American citizen? Not just how, but who? What kind of foreigner to become an American citizen? Naturalization Acts tell you a lot about how the country imagines its existing, its native-born population, based on who they're willing to let in or not let in. So, what did the Naturalization Act of 1790 reveal about America's self-concept? Who could be naturalized into the new United States? Free white person. Free white person. No slave is getting in. But no person of color, free or slave, is getting in either. Okay, look, the United States, based on the Naturalization Act, what I'm saying is the United States was founded as a white supremacist state. It's there as plain as can be who can become an American citizen. It's not just that they're free, it's that they're white. We'll eventually talk about the Dred Scott decision of 1857. A court case was trying to determine the status, not just of enslaved persons of color in the country, but free persons of color as well too. The Supreme Court in 1857 said, based on the Naturalization Act of 1790, America was founded as a white man's republic. In fact, one of the primary ways that the United States is described in the years between 1789 and 1860 is as a white man's republic. Don't shoot the messenger. That's what some of our most prominent politicians, including the head of the Democratic Party in the 1850s, a man named Stephen Douglas. That's how he would describe the United States, as a white man's republic. All right. Now we can debate today the continuing power of whiteness, white supremacy, white privilege, what have you, in the United States today. What is not debatable is the fact that whiteness was coded into American laws for the first half, into the Civil War years, when that began to be dismantled after that time. There's no questioning or debating. All right, it's there in the laws. White is given a privileged status in the most fundamental of our laws, determining who an American is, what an American is. This develops over the course of the 18th century. Can't put a specific date on it. The best that I can figure is, look, the old markers of racial discrimination just increasingly make less sense. Well, Africans aren't Christian, so we can enslave them. Increasingly, Africans are Christian. particularly after the Great Awakening, which I know many of you who did your did your chapter reviews for today. The African Americans in large numbers converted to Christianity during the Great Awakening. So increasingly saying Africans are not Christian, well, increasingly they were, or they're coming from regions of Africa that have converted to Christianity as well too. Well, Africans aren't English, they're foreigners, and so we can treat them as prisoners of war. Well, increasingly, by the time of the revolution, probably a native-born African population of anywhere from 100 to 120,000 who were born on English soil. So this old argument that, well, they're foreigners, they're alien, they were imported. Well, they weren't imported into this country, they were born here. Increasingly, those old markers of racial discrimination just don't make any sense anymore. And what's left? The completely arbitrary distinction of physiology and skin color. Determining the status, not just of enslaved, but free persons in the United States. In the earliest years of our republic. We'll obviously continue to talk about the history of racism as we go through this class, but my concluding points would be this. We can't talk about the development of slavery without talking about the development of white supremacy in North America too. And we have to get away from this idea that both slavery and white supremacy were like ready-made institutions that everybody agreed upon, that we just simply implanted from Europe into North America, or that we implanted from Africa into North America. That just wasn't the case. There was no consensus on lifetime or hereditary servitude. It's things that the colonists had to work out. The Puritans work it out pretty quickly. They also never really invest that heavily in African slavery as well too. It's just not the nature of their society. The English in the Chesapeake, on the other hand, they're much more gradual in their move towards defining slavery. But man, once they do, it just becomes foundational, not just to the stability of that region, but to the incredible wealth of that region. And it just grows and grows and grows. We'll talk more about slavery at the time of the American Revolution. It was frankly even with a population of 350,000 enslaved persons at the time of the Revolution, many people thought slavery was on its way out, a dying institution. So if that's the case, how do we get to 1860, right on the eve of the Civil War, and we have an enslaved population in North America at that time of 4 million? Well, that'll be probably the second, maybe even the third test, your final exam here, we'll get there. But do understand the gradual development of slavery and then white supremacy coming along after it to justify that practice. And then interestingly, we'll see even places where slavery went away, because if it's true, the white supremacy's major work was justifying the institution of slavery. I mean, we would expect that when slavery went away, that white supremacy went away too, but that's historically not what happens. White supremacy just finds new work to do in the North. We'll talk about that down the road as well too, but for now, understand the development of slavery in the Chesapeake, and particularly permanent permanent African hereditary slavery is something that was quite marginal for our first 80 years. And then for reasons that we've talked about here today, becomes very central to it. And it's just encoded all over the place. So in our remaining time, and we will still get out early, but I do want to, just remember, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Let's look at some pictures. Here's an ad for Virginia Tobacco. What does it say? Who is chosen here to represent the face of Virginia Tobacco? We can do this by comparison, just take a little bit of a look at it. We're gonna have a good sense of that picture. How about this one? Notice some differences there? What stands out to you? Quality of the drawing? Okay. Hmm. I think so. I don't think it was just that they didn't know how to represent a Caucasian. I think there was a deliberate decision that the face of Virginia Tobacco was going to be a person of African descent. Featured very exclusively, just them. What else do you notice in their hands? Well, a shovel and a pipe. Very different. One's a tool of labor, the other is a tool of leisure. How is this different? There's a very clear separation of tools of labor and leisure, aren't they? Right, both are pinned to a particular class of individuals, and so there's a much clearer division of labor. If you had to guess, because we don't have dates on these, if you had to guess, which one do you think came first? You think that one was probably first? I think so. I mean, for one, having an African as your representation of your civilization, but then having an African who enjoys the fruit of their labor. Just seems to contrast really sharply with what happens in the 18th century. As best as I can tell, the other ad is probably from the 1600s. This is probably from the 1700s. This is more than just simply an ad. This is more than just simply an ad for tobacco or for slavery, a particular division of labor. You see it also as an advertisement for white supremacy, right? What is the particular division of labor here? It seems to follow along the lines of physiology. It's not even that. It's we could get into issues of perspective. If we could ask those laborers in the back to kind of step forward and stand next to our tobacco smoker there, would they be about the same height? I mean, I don't think so. I think this guy is like, the Hulk standing up against the Spider-Man. We just massive. Is that just because artists didn't know how to do perspective at that time? We need to, we like to be able to read the letters and blog posts and all that kind of stuff where people are explicitly laying things out. We like the Massachusetts Bay Colony symbol where they put the words in the native's mouth, right? Come over and help us. You know, we like it when people spell things out, unless you're really good at doing that. But sometimes what we're left with in trying to figure out a country's or a people's understanding of itself. It's developing of a kind of hierarchy or even aristocracy in this particular case. All we're left with are pictures. Do these pictures say 1,000 words? I'll kind of leave it up to you. I mean, I think they're pretty stark and reflecting the kind of changes that we've been talking about in here. But you know, if you're not convinced, that's fine as well too. What we're left to reason with is the very slow progress of African laborers in the 1600s in British North America, and then a very rapid shift to that after 1700 for the reasons that I've talked about. External reasons, this changes in the international labor market, changes in international slave trade, but reasons internal as well too. Trying to make sure that a future Bacon's Rebellion cannot happen. And the way that that is done is through keeping your workers permanently on free rather than only temporarily on free. And we'll see by the time we get to the American Revolution, your Thomas Jeffersons, who considered slavery to be an immoral institution, still didn't feel like we could get rid of it. And it was largely the Bacon's Rebellion argument. If we free our slaves, they're going to be really angry that we enslaved them. They're going to rise up and kill us. We're going to have race war. The only way to avoid race war in North America is to continue the institution of slavery. So before slavery became profitable again under cotton production, perpetuation of slavery was carried forward by the old Bacon's Rebellion argument. There's no way we can end slavery without causing some kind of race war within our community, and so we need to perpetuate this institution. And so even the author of the Declaration of Independence ultimately cannot bring himself to end the institution of slavery. Now he'll free, I don't know if he frees all of his slaves, he frees some of his slaves. He certainly frees his slave children after his death, but thanks, Dad. He kind of screwed over his daughters, who then lost access to their labor. He kind of left his daughters without nothing when he freed those workers. But, a tangled national history with slavery. So when we remember American history, how much should slavery be central to that story, right? Is something that we'll have to continue to talk about as we continue through this class. Certainly it's something that Maclay will talk about as well too. But with this, so ends the first third of History 141. You have all the lecture material now that you need to be able to start writing your midterms. On Thursday, we will look at the guidelines. I'll talk a little bit about that. We'll have some time too for you to ask questions or possibly run possible observations by me and stuff. But we'll start reviewing. But it's time for us to shift. You rather than just kind of receiving my lectures, it's time for you to start taking lectures. I think I've said, you know, these midterms are going to be about 80% lecture, 20% readings. From the book, right? The weekly papers you write test your knowledge of the textbook. These essays that you're going to write are going to test your knowledge of lecture. So hopefully you've been coming along and taking good notes and stuff. If you haven't, I think I have 3 of the 4 lectures recorded. The first one, the sound didn't get recorded. These others have all been recorded. They're actually on YouTube already. I just haven't collected them and put them up yet because I want to get through the whole series of lectures before I start making them available, because I don't want you to rely upon them. The best way for you to get the information is to be here, taking notes, engaging. Any questions before we dismiss for today? right. I know sometimes when students say, oh, review, optional, I don't need to be there that day. I know what I'm doing. You're gonna want to be here. Trust me. Have a good one.